Okay, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining today. There are many of you, so we'll definitely keep some time for questions and answers. It's a coincidence, but this event on enhancing transatlantic cooperation in AI is taking place between Canada Day and Independence Day, so that's quite a nice timing. The overall objective is to nurture the Brussels conversation about the transatlantic relationship in general, because even when relations are fraying, it's always good to discuss and keep it going. And to emphasize the importance of continued cooperation and collaboration. But today in particular, we're going to look at how European and Americans are responding to China racing ahead with AI, and how they could work together on trade and investment and sharing resources and pooling them, and see what kind of assets each nation can count on and bring to the table. And the reach of AI has made it difficult to ignore, and it's now part of the transatlantic discussion as well. Another reason why we're hosting this event today is that the Center for Data Innovation is going to publish a report on how the US, the EU, and China fare with respect to AI, so adoption, talent, and skills, but also hardware, for instance. So we're going to publish that in the summer. Just to introduce myself briefly, my name is Eline Chivo. I work as an analyst at the Center for Data Innovation. We're an independent, nonpartisan think tank based in Brussels and DC, and we cover public policy that impacts, in particular, technologies and the digital economy. So back to the topic of today, enhancing transatlantic AI cooperation. There is a continuous shared economic interest in this. For instance, the EU and the US are still enjoying the world's largest and most integrated relationship in terms of trade and investment. So that's one reason why it's important to strengthen that relationship. But also there's a common interest in addressing the rise of China, which could soon dominate the AI field, and that would have an impact on the key economic sectors of the US and the EU. So perhaps one of the only chances we have to provide a check on China's quest to global AI dominance would be to work in an ever closer partnership on both sides of the Atlantic. So it's time to strengthen that relationship. So what are the avenues for cooperation and collaboration? So with us to discuss that today, we have Christine Berzina, Senior Fellow at the Alliance for Security and Democracy at the German Marshall Funds of the United States. Thank you very much for joining today. Wolfgang Wittke, Advisor to the Eureka, Head of Secretariat, DG Research and Innovation at the European Commission. Stéphane Lambert is Counselor, Head of Trade, Economic and Science and Technology Policy at the Mission of Canada to the European Union. And Kate Nyman, Senior Manager, Government Affairs and Public Policy at Cisco and Vice Chair, Digital Economy Committee at AmCham EU. Thank you very much for joining today. Now, to launch the talk, I'd like to ask you, Christine, to kick off with perhaps your perspective on where does the transatlantic relationship stand right now, and to what extent is AI part of this conversation, and why is it so important to discuss AI in this? So perhaps, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Aline. This is
Is it on?
it is on. Oh, no, it's not. No. Okay. Now it is. So good morning. I'm Christine, and I work for Alliance for Security and Democracy at GMF. When I talk about the transatlantic relationship, for me it's more of an EU-US piece, and so maybe that could create some sloppy language for transatlantic, because of course it is more than the EU, and the US and Canada is incredibly important in that relationship, and often has very different approaches and stances to the United States, and I think especially once we get into the AI conversation, I'll try to be very precise in speaking about the US and the EU and not transatlantic more generally, because I think it will provide us some of those slightly different approaches and different opinions. So yes, we have, between the EU and the US, there is a very robust trade and security relationship that is still very powerful today. But as much as there is that robust relationship, it is also a relationship that isn't as healthy as it was perhaps 4 years ago. And that is a backdrop through which I think we can start looking at the AI question a little bit more closely. There is increasing distrust between the EU and the US on various matters, including on economic relations and on trade. The threatening of sanctions for various sectors by the US has not helped create a free-flowing economic relationship across the Atlantic, and the mix of security and economic elements of policy has also strained perhaps some of this relationship. In the past, we had economic ties and we had security ties with NATO and the EU, but under the Trump administration, there's much more of an integration of security objectives and economic measures and how they fit together. So that is a backdrop that is important to look at when we look at AI. What does remain and what has not been affected in the last few years is the continuation of common values, similar approaches across the transatlantic space, and here I'm including Canada as well. Canada, the US, and Europe all are democracies and have a fundamental belief in civil liberties and rights in a way that is not true elsewhere in the world, especially China, relevant for the AI conversation. The fundamental underpinning of these values creates similar approaches to AI in the EU and in the US, despite perhaps rhetorical differences. Both the EU and the US have passed strategies for AI. And all of these strategies look at the ethical elements, the socioeconomic elements, education, jobs creation, some security, but also how do you prevent discriminatory practices. These elements are true on both sides of the Atlantic, even though perhaps the way that they are, the headlines are different. The case in point, in February when the United States passed its AI strategy, the launch was under the headline, the executive order on maintaining leadership in artificial intelligence. And so you can see even in the language there that there's language about America first, American leadership, American, America as the front runner, but in practice, the kind of elements that the EU has in its policies, and I trust my colleagues will talk more about what the EU doing in details, and the elements that the US is also seeking to address are the same. Why should there be cooperation in the transatlantic space on these issues? The values question here is incredibly important. Underneath everything, so artificial intelligence is already part of our lives and has the potential to improve all aspects of our economies and our day-to-day operations, everything from healthcare to cybersecurity to on emotion and how we move, how we buy things, how we treat our illnesses. But it also is a two-edged sword, and the other edge has the potential to increase a lot of the things in the world that are not in line with our democratic values in the transatlantic space. And this is the question of surveillance, for example, in China, and the use of these technologies, facial recognition, to infringe upon liberties. Also, machine learning isn't well equipped to handle diversity in the way that we want it to. And so we can use these tools of AI across the globe to infringe upon liberties, or to have more democratic, more ethical, more diverse norms built into them. That should be the role for the transatlantic community, including Canada and the United States. And that is in the EU's own strategy, their specific effort to reach out, in particular to Canada, to Japan, to Singapore. The US was not listed in that short list, to make sure that this human-centric approach does continue and is the foundational relationship. It isn't just China that we need to worry about when we look at AI as well, because it's really a dichotomy between the democracies and the authoritarians. And so if you look at the way that money and technology develops and flows between authoritarian states, there's really a lot of room for concern. If we look at Megvii, for example, a facial recognition company from China, it has benefited from investment from a Russia-China sovereign wealth fund. So you see already that the financial support for technologies that could restrict our liberties is already there. And the use and application of these technologies in systems that do not conform to our understanding of human rights and norms could prosper. So there is tremendous room and the need for transatlantic cooperation very broadly, and more importantly, the cooperation among all democracies to make sure that we are creating a world and we are creating the norms around AI that will promote what we hold dear in our societies. Because the speed at which everything develops from policies and technologies together means that if we do not act quickly, the authoritarian elements on the planet who are investing a lot of money in AI are going to be setting norms that are not compatible with our lives, and we certainly don't want in our homes, let alone anywhere else. So that's just a beginning for us to think about.
Thank you very much for painting that picture. And so I'd like to turn to you, Wolfgang. How do you see that compatibility between both sides of the Atlantic and your perspective from the European Commission?
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I would like to explain a little bit the context in which I intervene today. I'm working for Eureka, which is an intergovernmental research organization combining 47 countries and including the European Commission as a partner. And as an example, one of our partner countries, very strong partner countries, is Canada. One other of our partner countries is South Korea, South Africa, not the US. So I'm working for this intergovernmental research organization, and I'm detached from DG Research and Innovation. So I'm speaking on behalf of that organization, not on behalf of my commission service. In my previous job, over 7 years, I was in charge in DG Research and Innovation about the research and science cooperation with the United States and Canada in DG Research. So I know also the aspect and how research cooperation at government-to-government level is organized, is structured, what is possible, and where are maybe leading topics to cooperate. So against that background, I would like to say first that the cooperation history between the two sides of the Atlantic, the United States and Canada and Europe, is tremendous. It's unbelievable if you work in that area how many corporations exist. And it's not only a cooperation between one side and the Union, it's a cooperation between the transatlantic side, the other side of the Atlantic, and nearly all member states. And even this cooperation with different member states has increased depending on the areas we are talking about. So this means, for example, when I compare in my previous job compared to people dealing with other regions in the world, what concerns the United States and Canada, from a scientific and research point of view, you can basically say we can cooperate on everything. We may not be able to cooperate on extremely competitive technical scientific issues, but this is exactly the same what applies in the European Union. You can take any member state, something which is an absolutely competitive edge, competitive element towards a breakthrough or an innovation. These will not be the centered topics of, for example, the framework program or transnational cooperation activities. So this needs to be understood very clearly. But I strongly believe that with the United States and with Canada around AI, there are plenty of areas where we can cooperate just because of our history of scientific cooperation. Now, what does it mean practically or in concrete terms? In, for example, previous framework programs, the Commission has financed certain countries. For example, the BRICS have been financed in the last framework program, not the running one, which is not anymore the case. And we have today a picture where it's a relatively balanced approach around the world. And the United States is by far, but by far, #1 partner of the European Framework Programme. And without having now done a research, it is by far the #1 partner for many of the member states as a scientific partner. And you need to understand that context. And this context does not change because one president changes. And it will also not change if this president is re-elected. You have scientists which work in their scientific fields for 30, 40 years. Do you think they change their mindset because the president changes? And this is also something I would like to underline that I have noticed in my previous job. We are talking to, I think the United States, for example, has a picture of 23 or 24 major agencies, which are what we would call here an inter-service group in the Commission. They have an inter-agency group where they discuss, for example, transatlantic cooperation. So these are agencies which are huge. For example, one of them is NOAA, which is in charge of ocean research, whole Coast Guard, everything which is on seas and waters. I think they have 90,000 employees, and I don't know, I think a 5 billion budget per year. It's only a water, marine, ocean-related agency, one single in the United States. This agency, as such, the people there did not shift from left to right or from black to white after the election of President Trump. So this agency has still certain goals and has still certain values in having a clean ocean. We have a tremendous, Europe has a tremendous cooperation with NOAA and the United States on the North Atlantic Ocean on many topics which are ranging from mapping the oceans. We know more about the moon, for example, than we know about our oceans. So we do this together. So there are ships sent throughout the world, and we exchange the data, and we exchange the data for free, also together with Canada. So we have now created a trilateral cooperation there, which is extremely rich, and this scientific cooperation does not change due to, for example, certain trade-related issues. I think it's very, very important to understand. And we even push this topic further in the sense, fortunately, we have so good scientific and research cooperations because it means that there are a lot of ties that we have on which we can work together, which does not mean that there are political divergences on other areas where you may not be so easily capable to cooperate on issues like trade, for example. So do not forget that. Do not forget that we are talking about the scientific and the research community, and that these communities as such do not drastically change. Of course, these agencies get different budgets, get maybe a slightly different focus, but also there I can tell you that over the last 2 years I did not observe a major shift in orientations of these scientific agencies. And so, conclusion, scientific and research cooperation is very strong with the Union and with the Member States, and will continue to be strong for a very, very long time. Now, where do we want to set our focus on cooperation? This is something that we need to find out, and this is also something that we need to find out in Europe first. We are at a very early stage where the Commission and also the high-level experts group trying to set European federating elements. We have seen different national strategies. We see that member states also feel that they should take a certain leadership on artificial intelligence. UK seems to be, from a scientific perspective, with what is happening in Cambridge and Oxford, at a very, I would say, leading position. We are just in the situation where we're discussing Brexit, maybe not anymore these days, but it will come back. So UK has a strategy, France has a national strategy, Germany has developed a national strategy, some other Nordic states had at an earlier stage strategies. So there is not a single European approach, and also the European Parliament in the study has recalled that we should not come into a position where the fragmentation of the European system is one of the weaknesses. So for Europe, I think we are at a very early stage, and we are at a stage where we try to also to coordinate and to get our acts together. From the side of my own organization, Eureka, we just closed on the 1st of July, so 2 days ago, a call for proposals on artificial intelligence and quantum technologies with 10 countries of our membership. And these countries included, in particular, Canada. These countries included Israel. These countries included South Korea and a couple of European countries. We have received around 25 to 30 million proposals, which is really a very, very small element compared to the investments taking place, but it's also a starting point, and it's a starting point for our innovation agencies in the different member states to cooperate, and to cooperate also transatlantic. And this is one of the reasons why I'm happy to be here. We are planning as Eureka to organize such a call in the next years with the United States. We are nowhere, and we are really looking for partnerships, because this is a point I come maybe later to. Our research systems are very, very different, and it's really, compared to Canada, it's extremely easy. Canada has granting councils, has certain organizations. Our partner is the National Research Council Canada, which have a funding scheme which is matching very much what funding agencies in Europe do. So we talk to each other and we say, let's do it together. You pay your people, we pay our people. This is the way Eureka works, which is something which is not so easy in the United States. Just to give you a first glance of that, you don't find funding schemes in that way, top-down design. You have a lot of bottom-up research, and there the major funder is the National Science Foundation. But this is clearly basic research and is bottom-up. So defining calls together with the National Science Foundation is as such not so easy. So we see tremendous possibilities. We are at an early stage, and we don't see it from the angle that we need to fight against anybody somewhere around the world. Of course, we observe the competition and we observe what other countries do. It's not only China, it's also Japan. Israel recently announced that they want to do a major investment, which is one of our partners. So where can we cooperate, and which are the thematic areas or the topics on which we should do something together is the important point.
Thank you very much. I have a lot of questions, but it's time for now to turn to you, Stefan. How is Canada positioning itself in the transatlantic relationship and also in the global AI race? And how do you see the directions that the allies in this relationship should take? And maybe you can tell us more about what you can bring to the table as well in terms of AI access. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. First of all, thank you for thinking about Canada and inviting me to this table. We're a small northern country by all measures in the transatlantic relationship, but nonetheless, we like to think about ourselves that we can punch about our weight in the trade investment, in science, and now in basketball results. So thank you. So I think I would like to address the question. There's really two dimensions of the cooperation. There's the R&D dimension and the policy dimension. So Wolfgang touched a little bit about the R&D. Let me just comment on this. So we have a very deep and rich collaboration with the EU on science that predates, in fact, our framework agreement on trade investment that CETA. It goes a long way, and it goes a few decades back. We've institutionalized it back in the 1990s through a formal treaty relationship under which we discuss our mutual priorities and align our collaboration agenda on science. This relationship is very important to us. I can tell you that the EU is really our second largest market when it comes to R&D partnerships, public partnerships, but also private partnerships. In fact, if you look at the international publication of Canadian researchers, 40% of them are done with European researchers. We like to think that we can bring strong science to the table, and this particularly relevant to the AI discussion. Canada now has one of the largest concentration in the world of AI-related researchers. This is especially true in deep learning. We have a strong interest. As Wolfgang mentioned, we're one of the highest and largest participant in Eureka, I think the third largest, and one of the largest participant under the framework of Horizon 2020, despite the fact that we're not a funding partner. So Canadian researchers bring their own funding to the table, but they have a strong incentive to partner with European consortiums to achieve a higher impact in research. So this is one of the key motivational factors. We believe, like the EU, in open science and strong international collaboration. So we have a strong interest in enhancing bilateral cooperation, particularly in the field of AI. So we position our research institutes. So Wolfgang mentioned our top federal institute, the National Research Center, that has reorganized its research program in challenges. That this is very similar to what's going on with the new design of the framework program for Horizon Europe. And one of the key challenges will be AI. So we position ourselves to deepen and collaboration with international partners, and particularly the EU, on AI. I mentioned our umbrella agreement, the Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement with the EU. One of the key upcoming activities will be an AI workshop to discuss respective priorities on both sides to deepen collaboration. Wolfgang mentioned that we've just partnered and joined a joint call for proposal with Eureka and other partners on AI. And we just led a delegation of Canadian researchers to Eureka's Global Summit in Manchester, where our companies and researchers interested in deepen co-innovation and collaboration on AI went and met with other interested partners. So very strong R&D partnership and strong potential to enhance it. On the policy dimension, I think it's fair to say that Canada believes that further progress on AI can only be achieved with a strong governance framework over AI and a trusting relationship with citizens and companies. We believe in the tremendous potential that AI can bring to our economy, but we also believe that further progress will be hindered if we don't solve this conundrum, which is to establish a strong foundation of trust and transparency. And this is why we've engaged into deep discussions with our citizens in companies over the last year. We believe in a principle-based approach, in a multi-stakeholder approach, much like the EU, with its high-level expert group and the various roundtables it continues. So we're very pleased with the collaboration we've had with the EU in promoting a shared vision on the international scene through our work, for example, under our G7 presidency last year, the Montreal Declaration, etc. We're pleased with the EU support for our effort with France to establish an international panel on AI that can act as a global reference point on the ethical use of AI. And we also have a regular policy dialogue with the EU. The first one was conducted late last month in Ottawa with top EU officials and Canadian officials to share our experience, pool our expertise over how do we address these challenges, how do we offer guidance to our citizens and companies on the AI, how do we include them in the discussion, how do we promote inclusive AI, etc., etc. We can talk a little bit about more, but it goes beyond also the digital and the AI space. It addressed issues like data trust, issues like, because this is also an area very important for our citizens as we recognize the immense potential and job creation industries in AI. It also creates a lot of disruptions, and our citizens want to be reassured that we can manage it. And so we've engaged and we've promoted as part of a G7 presidency a whole discussion about the future of work. And with the EU, we have an ongoing labor dialogue in which we discuss our issues. We have very similar, set all the differences aside, but we have kind of a similar labor market structure. And so it's very interesting that we can share experiences, results of pilot projects, things like upskilling, digital skills, AI skills. And so we're building trust, and it's actually very useful to be able to share these kinds of examples. I'll stop here, but I'll be very interested in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Stéphane, for sharing your views and the position of Canada, both on the R&D side and the policy side. Turning to you, Kate, perhaps you can tell us more about the role of the private sector in enhancing that transatlantic cooperation, particularly in AI, and maybe catching on some of the things your fellow panelists said about how to enhance trust and how to fill the gap in funding or investment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't think this is working. Hang on, where do I turn this on? That's a slightly different microphone as well. Does it work? Yeah, yes. Now it works. So thank you very much, Eileen. I think maybe just also to provide a little bit of context, maybe just explain a little bit about Cisco for those people in the audience who may not know Cisco so well, and to explain a little bit what we do in AI. So Cisco is a leading network technology company. We started in 1984 by two Stanford professors who were working in different campuses, and therefore their networks couldn't communicate with each other. So they developed the first multi-protocol router. And that's very much a story. Of course, today we do a lot more than that, but I think it's an interesting story in terms of how our company was started. Because that's what we do, right? We connect the unconnected. That is Cisco's mission, and we believe that amazing things can happen when you do so. We apply AI, machine learning, across our entire portfolio, which is very, very broad now. So we do enterprise networking, telecom networking, enterprise communications, and cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is one of our fastest growing business areas. Which, because we are a networking company, because in a digitized world, because in an AI-fueled world, security has to be inherent in the network to secure the billions of devices that are going to be at the edge of the network. This is really a very, very strong focus area for us. So we very much are an AI company, and I think this is really important, and I think you can see how the discussion as well has sort of moved on from AI, oh, this is this new kind of like standalone technology. No, it's a technology that companies are using to integrate into their existing products and solutions to enhance them. But at the same time, of course, we do absolutely recognize that AI is special, like these sets of technologies are special, because they do try to imitate human intelligence, and therefore we very much recognize the kind of responsibility that we have as a company and that industry in general has to use technology responsibly. We see it very much as going hand in hand with our market and with our business development, because even as a B2B company, we don't sell anything to consumers, right? We're a complete B2B business. But for our customers as well, they definitely want to adopt our AI-fueled products and solutions, but of course they want to understand, well, how does it work, what does it do? So it's, for us, we believe that it's those companies who do AI responsibly that ultimately will win. Maybe I think, just to give a couple of examples, because there are very, very big benefits to be had, and I think this is what we constantly have to, like, we have to think of it not as the responsibility, the ethics, and the opportunity. We should not think of them, and maybe that sometimes happens a little bit in the policy debate, that they almost get put into this kind of false economy where we almost look at them as trade-offs. And again, as I was saying, we don't really see it that way. We believe that they go hand in hand. We understand that they can be misused, but we think that if you do it in a beneficial way, that's when you gain these amazing benefits. And just, you know, to give, especially as I was mentioning, like on the security, right? It's about, one, using the network to secure the data and the massive amounts of data that will be flowing across networks for AI, but it is also using AI to enhance security. And so, for instance, using machine learning and data analytics in our security portfolio, we've managed to lower the time to detect and respond to security flaws from 100 to 200 days down to as low as 4 hours, right? So that's just an example of massive benefits that you can actually gain. We're using machine learning to detect malicious but encrypted traffic by detecting pattern and traffic flows. And this is actually a massive innovation. This is something we announced a couple of years ago, because more and more encryption traffic is necessary for privacy, but it has posed a challenge for cybersecurity professionals, because like, how do we then detect encrypted malicious traffic? So we've actually developed a way to detect that traffic without having to decrypt, but where machine learning and data analytics, by detecting patterns in traffic flows, can see, wow, okay, that's coming from, you know, that's malicious. So that's just an example of some of the benefits that AI can actually really bring. As I was mentioning, I think on the ethics, right, I mean, as other panelists have already said, in the transatlantic context, we fundamentally share values, so it absolutely makes sense for us. And I don't, you know, these are conversations that are happening. These are conversations that we're supporting as businesses. We're developing our own guidelines as well. What's important to bear in mind is when governments are looking to develop these guidelines, and ultimately I think this is what the EU is doing as well with the high-level expert working group, is creating the processes, right, where industry and academia and civil society and businesses can come together. And bearing in mind, when we do develop these guidelines, that AI is a set of technologies that has extremely diverse applications across sectors, with also an important distinction between the B2B and the B2C markets. So we really have to remember to be principles-based, and then the companies, and so that's one of the things that we're working on. How do you translate these principles that we all agree on? How do you translate them into more concrete guidelines for your engineers and for your researchers and your business developers? And that's where, you know, you have to be very, very case-specific. So I think I'll leave it at that there, and we can sort of dive into some of the specific topics in the discussion.
Thank you very much. But I'd like to bounce back to, because you said something in particular with respect to the conversations on ethics and common values is important. But how is this an argument for the competitiveness, for instance, of the European Union and Canada and the United States in the global AI race? How is that supporting?
Well, if you look at the world as a positive summons, and so we very much believe that the transatlantic economy, including Canada, right, is much stronger when we work together. That is a general point, right? It's not just applying to AI, but it certainly also applies to AI.
Wolfgang, perhaps turning to you. So we see that there's a lot of assets that the European Union has to offer, for instance, in terms of talent. But can you comment on or speak to the gap between that presence of talent and the skills that we have, and the fact that we're lagging behind in terms of the commercial applications of AI?
I'm not sure that I can reply on that specifically for AI, and but maybe in general the way from coming from research to innovations and commercial applications, it will probably also apply to artificial intelligence. A study from last year, also I think from Parliament, has clearly shown that I would call it, the knowledge and the capabilities of Europe are absolutely at the level of all competitors in the world. We should not be as very often in a situation has a feeling the train is gone, we have lost again, and things will happen somewhere else outside Europe, and we will just be followers and suffer from what comes next. So the Europe as a whole has very, very strong capabilities in artificial intelligence, and the high-level expert group issued last week the request for a very ambitious roadmap and gave a figure of around 20 billion to be invested, expected to be invested in the coming years per year, which is not nothing. It's quite a substantial figure. If you see the whole next framework program as planned for 7 years, it's 100 billion. You only see that. We expect in Horizon Europe special activities in public-private partnership. Now the question, how do we come from the point of very good research to very good products? Let me take two aspects. We talked already a bit about it, but I would like to add a little bit more from my side on that. I think that the whole discussion around artificial intelligence is probably, as we have seen in other areas, setting also the appropriate framework for the development and integration of this technology in our society. I would really like to talk about our society. This means that, as we said, ethical values, but in particular also education and skills. As an example, not only the European Commission, but I know my best as being here, DG Employment is working since years on skills development. What does it mean? What are the digital skills we need? Our European Institute of Technology is developing approaches where you find research and innovation connected to the curricula of potential engineers. In the educational field, there is a clear request in the coming years that STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, become very strong elements of our educational systems throughout the European Union. I don't want to overstate things, but also the quest that there is a strong gender imbalance in that area. I think in STEM education, or I think it was about close to deep learning and data scientists. There's a ratio of 1 to 9 between female students and men students. All these aspects are aspects of our society, the way we want to live and the way we want to integrate a technology which is upcoming into our lives. I talked to a friend the other day and I found this example very good. I think artificial intelligence and decision making is already part of our life, and it will become more and more part of our life, daily life, as something like energy is today. When steam engines were invented, people were very much afraid of that. But today, energy for us is a plug we pull into the wall, and that's it. Of course, there are political questions. Is this clean energy? Is this renewable energy? And so on. But I think this type of technologies will become part of our lives, and the framework is the thing to be set. Now, in setting the framework, which is also including standards, regulations, possibilities for companies to develop, we can also boost innovation. There were, I think it's about 15, 20 years ago, maybe still today, quite a couple of people also said, you are starting to develop a navigation system by satellites, but GPS exists. Why do we need Galileo? You start to develop Earth observation system, but the Americans have very good satellites, they observe whatever. We have today Copernicus, which is providing data sets, standard data, which becomes the reference for global disaster analysis. So think about these examples where also very often the technological development was seen as something too late and behind. But in setting a large framework for 500 million people EU market, in which another billion around the world would like to enter, setting the legal framework for the societal, the security, the technical standard, this is a huge impact. And this is also, I think, where I see the development for very strong innovation potential. If from the beginning of the perception of using this technology, we are also creating a larger framework in which innovation can much more be integrated, but also accepted by individuals.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you said something about skills and how it's important to have a population that's equipped with the right digital skills for future labor market needs. But how do you concretely do that? How can US, Canada, and the EU help each other, use each other's assets, and fill the gaps? So maybe I can ask Stefan to address this question. Concrete measures.
Sure. Can I, if you
Oh, yes.
permit, I'd like to go back to the competitiveness issue and because Keith mentioned something very important, which is how do we now translate, principle-based approach to standards or regulations that we can apply. I think this is very important, and you talked about the competitiveness. We really believe that, much like, if I can risk an analogy, the food and the agri-food market, it's growing because it's built on a strong, trusting relationship between consumers and all the supervisory agencies. Citizens need to have confidence that the food they eat won't kill them or poison them, and that it's safe, and the molecules or pesticides, and I don't want to spark the debate, but that is used on to grow plants is safe, and it's based on sound science, and so. On AI, you can see a world where further progress and citizens demand assurances that the machines that they want to buy won't have adverse effects on their health and safety. That if you think about automated decision making, that we can understand and we can have confidence in the algorithms that are developed and that the decisions are not biased. So I think there is a lot of. It goes back to your competitiveness argument. We have to solve this. If for our companies to be competitive and for our citizens to have absolute confidence in the future products to come. Now, how do we go about that? And we're not there yet, but there are some various avenues. I know that, for example, a few years ago, when we thought about the regulation over nanotechnologies and how do we ensure the safety of nanotechnologies, well, one of the first things we thought about was to use international collaboration in the science beyond the regulation, and we had a very successful project under Horizon 2020 a few years ago, exactly on this aspect. An international collaborative projects on the science between regulation to avoid also competing frameworks. So there's a role for international collaboration on standards. This is a conversation that is ongoing in which our certification bodies, our standards councils, our regulators are very much interested in. And there is forums in which we could promote this dialogue, and we absolutely need a conversation on this. We have bilateral avenues under our trade agreement with the EU, the CETA. We have a regulatory cooperation forum in which, without prejudging the outcome, we have a discussion to build trust in each other's regulatory framework, and in which we can look forward, anticipate where we will be regulating, and avoid also trade distorting or trade restricting measures. I would also like to say that regulation doesn't mean limitations or restrictions. And in the ecosystem that we've developed on AI in Canada, particularly the Montreal-based one, the focus is very much on positive the focus is very much positive. I mean, we have companies like Element AI and others that are developing solutions focused on the ethical use of AI. So it's a very positive undertaking. It doesn't necessarily mean restrictions. Now, the second question, which is on the climate to make further progress and to grow AI. I think there's a whole suite of tools to look at, but our companies are particularly interested. If we ask now Canadian companies, and I'm sure in the EU's case or the US case, it's going to be the same. They will say access to talent. There's a shortage of highly skilled workers on AI, and this is affecting the industry. And this is one thing that I'm particularly proud that that Canada has done in recent years. Well, two things. First, our province has been very active on the international stage to promote the Canadian ecosystem in all the AI international conference, in a pitch to come to Canada, because we have a very strong investment climate and ecosystem in AI. But the second thing we did is to develop a global scale strategy. And right now, if you're highly skilled workers on AI and you come to Canada to work on a short-term project, you will be exempt from the working permit. You can come and it's very mobile, global talent stock, and so we know that, and we develop this approach. And if you come for a longer-term project, we promise you a service standards of 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, you don't get your visa and your working permit application process. And that went very far into assuring our companies that established in Canada, or those that grow in Canada, that they can have a predictable, steady access to global talent and to continue growing. And now the results is that the number of Canadian companies in the AI field is growing by 30% year-over-year. We have now more than 800 companies, and we have the fastest startup creation rate in the world.
Thank you for that concrete example. Jumping back to the way you started your argument with respect to the policy framework. So AI is not necessarily a zero-sum game, right? And Christine, you mentioned the values very much, and your fellow panelists also emphasized this. Could we perhaps still work with China on some areas? Do you see that's possible and valuable, and why?
I think that it's perhaps a misunderstanding to say that there's just a Chinese model for AI development and a Western democratic model for AI development, because the world of research on these fields is incredibly integrated. And so even on technologies that we would find challenging because of our norms and our principles, there is continual involvement by Western research organizations, universities in the US with Chinese companies using the technology back and forth and building upon each other's knowledge. These aren't isolated bubbles because the knowledge does flow back and forth. And so the aim here is to create the standards globally that we would want to be seen, because if there are standards for applications, or even a thought to the application made by researchers in Europe or Canada or the United States, when they work with companies that are in China or in places where the applications are perhaps could be problematic, if the understanding of how things could be used and should be used are also go along with it, then that makes all of us stronger. And so I think it's really important to understand that it isn't just a closed lab in China that does one thing and a closed lab in the US or Europe that does a different thing. And so that is why it's very important to talk about these things openly, but also to have accountability on what are the implications of technologies and their uses, and that is something that will be strongest if it is a conversation that we have collectively. And what the problem, I think, where we are right now, in the transatlantic relationship, but between the US and its global partners, is that the US isn't bringing along everyone else for a full understanding about what is at stake. Just looking at briefly the Huawei conversation, there at the root of it, there is the declaration from the United States there's a security risk, which is for all of its allies a security risk, but the way that it is presented and the way that the rhetoric, the tone, the imposition of this is very challenging for all of the US's partners. If we talk about AI and also talk about the values and the democratic principles that need to be in the core of it, it's very important for us not to go down that same rabbit hole of impositional language and instead talk about the common development. Because Europe, the EU's very thoughtful approach through the high-level working groups, the ethical guidelines, which have so many dimensions. This is something that can be very much applied on the other side of the Atlantic, where the thinking on this isn't as far. There is an appetite through these strategies from the White House, from the Department of Defense, where these things need to be addressed, but there's no meat on the bones yet. And so collaboration between the EU and Washington on this would be very important to guide the way forward on this. And if you look at the way that European leadership on GDPR, for example, was immediately welcomed by the state level politicians in the United States, where Californian state legislature says, well, if all of our tech companies can apply these very strict privacy standards in Europe, why can't they do it here? And pass a very similar legislation in Canada. Having European leadership on the ethical dimension of AI also provides guidance and a step forward for a lot of US policymakers on how they can structure these arguments. And that also is potentially a way to avoid some of this top-level, more challenging conversation and really apply these more granular principles where they do take hold and where clearly there is an appetite for them.
I fully agree with you, and but it's more my personal conviction that if on both sides of the Atlantic we can take a leadership on those aspects of legislation, ethical aspects, social aspects, what does it mean for education, for our society in future, and we can set standards, maybe not all legislative or written down black or white. If we can agree on these type of standards, why should China not follow these standards? They would not even have to bother about it. They would have this is market access. If you do the things like the global society expects things to happen, you get the access to the market, and also technically you are following that. So why there should not be a problem. However, it also means that you need to be in a collaborative framework. It means that you need to have, and it's not only about US, Canada and Europe, it's also about Latin America, it's also about including Africa. Africa will be a country which will probably explode in development of IT, and then also related to that artificial intelligence. So you also need a multilateral framework in which you are capable to work together. For Europe, it also means, again, we need to speak with one European voice at the global scene and not with different strong national voices. There's an example that it seems that certain technologies of AI will not be kept by certain patent laws or standards. Our regulation that is not fit for artificial intelligence. We know that, and so why shouldn't we work together?
Again, lots of questions. I'd like to ask briefly, Kate, perhaps, if you would like to react on this discussion on the standards and the guidelines and how to translate the principle-based conversation into guidelines for industry. How is industry seeing this discussion?
Well, I think to a large extent, right, it has to be the individual companies, because it's the individual companies who understand their tools and their technologies and their product portfolios. So I think we just have to accept that this is an area where we'll be able to set the high level principles, but the companies are the ones to understand, right, in terms of like what it is that we do as a company and how do we need to apply it. And then of course you need to have the transparency and you need to have the dialogue and the scrutiny. And I think this is something that's happening also, as I was saying, you know, between the businesses, right? I think this is very much the market development as well. I think it's a little bit what when we started talking about this at the beginning of the previous term, everyone was saying trust is the most, trust is the most. Companies won't digitize, they won't start using cloud, they won't start using these technologies unless that they trust that the data will be safe and it will be secure and they can, you know, control. Now it's like, yeah, right? I mean, this is a non-point at this time. And so I think it's a little bit, hopefully it's going to be a little bit the same, right, with AI.
Thank you. Wolfgang talked about the need for a multilateral framework. Stefan, is that the ambition of the IPCC of AI? What's the name of it? IPAI?
Sure. Yes. I mean, there's multinational organizations that work on guidelines and the framework, the UN through the UNESCO, the OECD. But yes, you're right. The international panel on AI that we jointly announced with France last year, that is open to all potential participants, has this ambition to serve as this neutral zone that doesn't belong to a particular organization or a particular country, where you know, that can aggregate all the expertise where global experts can meet. But also that has the ambition to develop strong partnerships with civil societies, with academia, with governments, and act as a sort of a clearinghouse of information. So it's really a strong reference point, ultimately, that can lead to the promotion of the adoption of global norms. It's very important for us to have this idea of neutral zone, because we have this ambition, thinking about the developing world, that, you know, they can also feel that they can join such a panel. Stay tuned, because momentum is building, and we anticipate a launch soon.
Thank you. Wolfgang, you mentioned something earlier, and I wanted to react to it. I'm going to be a little bit provocative, but actually I talked about this Copernicus program with someone from there yesterday. And what he told me was a lot of member states collect that data, geospatial data, but they don't necessarily make it available in the public domain. But it's data that's high quality and perhaps the best that you could get. I mean, you can get alternative kinds of data out there, but what member states collect is really, really good. They're supposed to make that available by 2020, but the expert I talked to wasn't sure whether that enforcement was going to happen. So how can we do more of that, really within the EU itself already, trying to publish the data that we have to make it more open? Because the solution that they were considering was to buy data from providers, because member states wouldn't make their own available. Would you like to react to that comment?
I try. It's a very specific issue, but let me give you another example also of. I think it's a question of also the identity of our European Union and our cooperation in Europe. And again, it's more my perception as citizen. We are still at a very early stage of 60 years after, 70 years after Second World War. We are not yet there that our countries are easily and trustfully exchanging everything, and including data. Nevertheless, what you observe is that the Union and the Union institutions are very often the driver towards that, I would say, joint approach or more unified approach. Take the example of open access to scientific data, which really make sense, and it has been really the European Union who has just put a big stone into the water and created a lot of waves to say, why is scientific data, which is publicly funded, not accessible to any scientist around the world? And we, as union, with a union program, try to do that and advocate for that. And it will be similar on data issues, like data of Copernicus or other initiatives. But we are not yet, also in Europe, we are not yet at the stage where we can say, okay, we share everything. It's due to our institutions, our treaties. We follow the discussions over the last years of the leadership, how complicated things can be to come to a common decision. But I must say, I'm very proud of being European in that context, because we are moving, we are constantly moving in, I think, a good direction, which is publicly discussed, which is a framework that is accessible more and more to citizens. I don't want to blame or shame, but for example, look on the other side of the Atlantic. There is a very close trade relationship between the US and Canada, but they don't share a lot of things like data access, what our universities do or whatsoever. So they are just neighbors, and if you look around the border between the United States and Canada, I don't know exactly the figures, but I think there's a share of 80% of all Canadians live in more or less, I think, 100 kilometers from the border. So you could clearly say, look, they are so close. And we are 28 countries with so different cultures and languages, and we are pushing a lot for doing things together. But it's not so easy, and it's not overnight, and it's not because one wants it now that he gets it now. He may get it only in a year or two. So we are still I think in a relatively early development of our cooperation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give each of you a chance to make a final point before we move to the audience for questions and answers, if you wish to. Is there anything that you wanted to bring to the table today? And
well, just as a hot pursuit and what Wolfgang was saying, I think this issue of data is critical, and this is something our citizens have asked during our consultations. We need to get the data right, and citizens want assurances that they can trust the privacy framework in which their data is collected and used. And they need confidence also that data can be transported across borders confidently. And there's work to be done on this. Canada has done work on three fronts. First, working on the interoperability of data protection frameworks through forums like the OECD, like APEC, and increasingly with the EU around the EU's own approach to GDPR. Second, through bilateral agreements, like the new USMCA. I was surprised it hasn't come up yet, maybe in the discussions, but in the USMCA, we've modernized completely. I mean, in the old NAFTA, there was no chapter on digital trade. Now there is a chapter on digital trade, and there are strong provisions around data protection in the interoperability of our privacy frameworks, and on open data, which will be key to make further progress on AI. We have a similar provision with the EU under CETA, and it's a different approach, but we work very closely through EU's adequacy framework to build and maintain trust in our ability to transfer data across the border. And of course, lastly, through the multilateral framework, and we are looking for an ambitious outcome of the e-commerce negotiations at the WTO.
you said something about the importance of privacy on both sides of the Atlantic. Christine, how do you see that discussion? Is there a difference between the way you would see privacy in the US and maybe Canada?
say the EU thinks more about privacy and has thought more robustly about privacy than the United States has on the federal level. So that's a whole series of caveats. The United States is thinking, and policymakers are thinking much more closely now about some of the issues surrounding technology. And what has for a long time been a fairly hands-off policy on regulating things in the tech space is changing to try to understand what the social norms and social dimensions are. And just this month there was a hearing on the House side in Congress about AI and deep fakes, more from the security side, so really pushing that forward. But privacy is also a part of this conversation. And so I think that if Europe speaks to the United States, looking from a security side and showing how how privacy and other elements are part of that collective value and interest, and that is a way to be heard and to really provide solutions. Because I think the political appetite right now is developing to address these issues, but there isn't that much there yet, and the EU could really help shape that conversation. It has a lot of normative power in various places, including in the United States, and I think that shouldn't be underestimated and shouldn't be lost in the rhetoric. I have a quick thought though on education too. We've talked about skills and necessity for very high-tech skills, manufacturing coming back to Europe, and the need to have the workforce that is there. That is one side of the coin. I want to also emphasize that the other side of that same coin is to develop and encourage skills that are not something a machine can replicate, which is the creative element of the education. And so I think we just make sure we don't get lost here on the need for having minds that think outside of the box in order to remain competitive. Too, that is something that is in the conversation, but I think we don't emphasize quite enough.
I would like to just add one word, which I noted now. If I think also personally, the Facebook Cambridge Analytica affair, and the threats that artificial intelligence, which are really ethical and social threats to our system and our democracy. If you think about this, we have very good reasons to work together and get these things correctly framed.
I might just want to, and this comes back a little bit to an earlier point, but I think if we want to sort of have the holistic debate around AI as well, I think we do need to also look at the investment and the uptake piece, and Wolfgang was touching upon it a little bit in terms of, and it is sort of a little bit the hard nut to crack for us in Europe. I remember like way back when I was still working in the European Parliament for an MEP in the ITRA committee, that was something we were always discussing. We're very, very good at basic innovation, but then turning these into applications, and for our companies as well to actually start adopting these new technologies. And I think we are seeing a lot of progress in Europe. There's an interesting OECD analysis back from December 2018. So Europe is still in the third place, right? But we have gone from 1% to 8% of private equity investment into AI startups. So there's definitely a positive momentum, but I just think that's also something that we need to keep bearing in mind when we're having this discussion. We need to really remember to do it in a 360-degree kind of very holistic fashion, because as I started out by saying, right, this is, yes, we want to do this in an ethical, responsible manner, but there are also such huge benefits to be had if we do this, and we do it in this sort of right way, in the ethical way. But that also means that we can't lose focus in Europe at, well, why? I mean, again, from 1% to 8%, that's really good, but is it good enough, right? And again, I think from the EU side, they're doing a lot of the right things with Horizon Europe, and the focus on AI, a bit of money for AI in the Digital Europe program as well. But I mean, that's just one side of the coin. That's the public funding, and we absolutely need that. We need to make sure that it's synergized with the national, but we also have to look at the private side, and there we do still see a bit of a lag. So we also really need to focus on that, I think, and to remember that has to be part of the debate as well. How do we bring that up? And we see quite big differences between European countries of the money being spent. Again, looking at the OECD study, it's the UK, then it's France, and then it's Germany, and then the rest, like 20% is then. So those three have like 80%, right, and then 20% the rest of the EU. So we have, and Wolfgang already mentioned the UK. So we're opening an AI centre with the UCL. So the UK is definitely in a strong position, and France and Germany, we know they're also from the political side putting a lot of focus into this. But then there are all the rest, and so I just think that we can't lose sight of that focus as well, because otherwise, you know, we're going to end up with some amazing ethical guidelines, but we don't have any technology to apply them to.
I think that's a very good point you're mentioning. For those interested as well, that's, the member states are currently adopting their national AI strategies, and in many of those there's a lot about how digital innovation hubs, and we have a lot of them, should be better integrated so as to allow for innovators, developers, industry, researchers to meet and develop applications that will actually be relevant and find their market, to avoid going through this, I found the expression once, which was the global valley of death, they call it, between what's happening in a lab and what's actually working commercially later. So a lot of hopes ahead, but yeah, let's try to keep it focused. I'd like to turn to the audience. There is no microphone, I think, so you'd have to speak loud. Please say your name, your organization, and who you would like to ask the question to. Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Elisa Jensen from ASD, and my question is for you, Kate Nyman, or of course everyone on the panel, but my question is on patent ownership and how much this plays into AI. To what extent are you hindered by patents on the industry side, and how much does that affect the transatlantic relationship?
I mean, to be honest with you, I can't. This is not something that has come up. That this is something that we feel like a big hindrance. So it's something that, yeah, I would have to come back on that.
Carsten S. with Banco Santander. I have three quick questions. First, probably for Wolfgang. The DG Connect is looking into common European data spaces, and there's a lot of funding allocated for the next EU budget, I think 2.5 billion euro in particular for AI research. So I wonder whether Eureka or your projects will be part of these common European data spaces to provide access to different data from different sectors. And second question was on transparency, accountability, trust. So would a European cloud, which is always in the talks, help to create more trust to European citizens, as over 90% of the data right now of European citizens is controlled by non-European companies? And I think the last one question to all of the panel, GDPR, or maybe to the practitioners more from the business, is like we have a discussion here in Brussels, of course, that the data minimization principle is not very suitable for AI development. So how do you see that from a business point of view? Thank you.
Thank you. Next, first question on the European data space.
I start. For what concerns our organization, thank you for your question. I try with my colleagues to very much place the activities of intergovernmental research into the discussion of what is called the strategic planning for Horizon Europe. And in particular, Eureka has, I did not go into the details, they have very strong industry clusters where big companies are focused on certain technologies, on data communication. The clusters should be placed in the context of what will be the future partnerships, public-private partnerships, what can clusters do, and that there is a connectivity. I think this will be an ongoing topic for the next years, also to coordinate research. We started a couple of years talking about the European research area. It has faded out a little bit. It will come back under another topic. We need to coordinate our activities clearly, and in particular create public-private partnerships. On the cloud issue, I'm not really an expert. From my perspective, I think, well, I hope it will create trust, but it creates, in any case, also an example on which we can learn. in preparing also for today, I was surprised. Maybe my data I received is outdated, but if I think about the idea of, I don't know, I don't use it, but if you speak into Siri, this is stored for 6 months with identification who said it in a private company in the United States, and for another 18 months it's still stored what you have said for learning and improvement of the system. I'm not so sure that this is something which would easily pass in a couple of EU member states. So we need to really understand where that data is stored, how it is stored, and what are implications of that.
On cloud or GDPR?
So maybe just to start with the GDPR. So we very much, I mean, we welcome the GDPR, we support the GDPR. We actually see it as inherently good for business, and as really having, it's a really important building block for the wider digitization. If you're interested sort of in more details in terms of how we view GDPR in terms of the impact to business, to us, but also sort of to the wider ecosystem, we do like an annual benchmarking study, which contains a lot of really useful information on this. I think on the European, look, I think again, this was an idea that sort of popped up again at the beginning of this term that we're now sort of ending. What really matters and what we do and what we focus on as a business is securing the infrastructure so that the data is safe and secure. Then customers will have different preferences, and I also think that's the important thing, right? Cloud isn't some unitary thing, right? You'll have the public cloud, you'll have the private cloud, you'll have the on-prem, and it's really, it depends on who's the customer. What are the customers' needs? Is it private sector? Is it a regulated sector? Is it public sector? So how you do cloud is not something that you do in any one way. And for us, that's what matters. What are the customer's preferences? What kind of regulations do the customer have to live up to? How do we secure the data so that they can use the cloud in a trusted way? And for us, that's what matters.
Anyone else wanting to make the next question? Or you want? Yes, please go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I can't really comment on the European cloud, but maybe on the GDPR. So we take a strong interest in the GDPR as Canadian companies operating in Europe, or Canadian companies that collect, use, treat data on European citizens have to comply on GDPR. So when you look very closely at the GDPR, the Canadian framework is different, but it is very similar in terms of objective and method. It's not a line-by-line comparison, but, and so it goes back to my previous comment about the interoperability. How do we have this trusting relationship that we can have full confidence that our frameworks are comparable and offer a similar level of protection? How can citizens have this trust? And this goes back to the importance of discussing our issues within our trade agreement or within international forums. So we do a lot of work with partners, with the EU and other partners to build this trust and this confidence. Your question about clouds and transparency. So it goes back to having a sense of control over one's data and confidence of where it is stored, how it's going to be used, and if it is misused, what are the available recourses. Our privacy commissioner in Canada has established a lot of good collaboration with privacy commissioners around the world, and this is important to conduct investigations and offer some recourse to Canadian citizens in case their data are being misused or breached.
I just had a quick question, because Karsten, you mentioned a data minimization issue. Does your framework in Canada minimize the amount of data that companies can collect?
I can get back to you on this. I don't know.
We'll verify. Thanks. Yes, question now.
My name is Jeff Simon from the Financial Management Community. And I want to come back actually to the global financial AI that both Mrs. Gisinger and Mr. Wittke touched upon. Actually, exactly 1 week ago at the first AI Assembly meeting, they shared one of the most important points is that we share success stories about AI and that we create success stories about AI. My question is, isn't it timely to think jointly about something like a global institution for AI? And actually my second question would be, who would be the architects of this global institution?
Thank you. Any takers?
I think it's a brilliant idea. But for example, for Europe, we are at the starting point to do things for Europe, and I would not say we are struggling, but we will get there. And I think the European institutions are not afraid to take any leadership in that. But no, your question is absolutely brilliant, and I think it's needed. Now, at the end, it should also be something which is really, let's say, impactful.
Sure. I mean, I think this is the ambition of the international panel on AI, and that we have Canada and France has launched, but it's supported by the EU, it's supported by a number of participants, and it's open to all. A draft declaration has been worked on by France and Canada, and we hope to pursue the discussions in the upcoming G7 summits in Biarritz, and ultimately this is going to be a panel much like the panel on climate change established under the UN leadership, which aggregates international expertise and provides for a neutral arena and a conveyor on AI international.
I'm encouraged by these approaches. At the same time, I do want to flag the fact that if we have many additional bodies just for AI, I would be afraid that that AI gets set apart as something that is unique and a thing in and of itself, rather than something fully integrated in all of our processes across all sectors. And so I think that the otherization of AI would not be helpful in the creation of any kind of body or platform, because I think that would, because that is so divorced from the way that the technology is used in practice, that I think a more inclusive understanding of it would be incredibly important, because we do not want these political bodies and political processes to be too far removed from the business side, from the technological side, and to be seen as an encumbrance. If AI is to become like like electricity, which powers and is in everything, or the internet. There's no international body on the internet, which also touches everything. So I think we want to make sure that we do not otherize these technologies, but instead have apply the ethical norms that we are interested, the transparency, the inclusivity, the protections involved across all of these sectors. Because if we think of it all holistically, we will be solving challenges in various areas. And so inclusivity rather than otherization is a point I'd like to emphasize.
Yeah, and that's valid for the transatlantic relationship. Just better integrate AI would be the right way to go, and it would also be a way to demystify the technology. I saw one last question in the audience, just being mindful of the time.
Jan Eggert, I'm a consultant. My question goes into a similar direction. I mean, there are so many international frameworks. I think the G20 also touched in their Osaka declaration on data economy, creating rules for data economy. I'm not quite sure exactly what they decided, but there was something in the declaration. I think the WTO also wants to deal with data issues more, and e-commerce rules and so on and so on. So perhaps somebody can comment on that also.
that there are too many international, intergovernmental frameworks already that would cover
They're already there, but is that a possibility that they deal with that more, or?
I mean, I could just comment quickly on the e-commerce track that the WTO is looking at now is separate. It doesn't have anything to do with AI. They're looking at how can we create new trade disciplines for the digital economy, right? Which is something as industry we've been asking for a very long time, because we're seeing increasingly new kind of behind the barriers digital protectionism popping up in a lot of countries. And one of the issues is that because a lot of the WTO rule books were just created before, the digitalized economy. So we need new disciplines, and I think let's keep that track focused on that, right? We need new commitments. This track hopefully will end up actually delivering real trade commitments and not just be, how do I put this in a nice diplomatic way, this panel, it's not just like a lot of hot air in terms of like, oh yes, we'll all talk about these issues, and no, we want hard commitments on some of these digital trade barriers. So I think that's just, to that very separate question around, is this something that the e-commerce track is about? No, it's not what it's about, and I definitely don't think that's what it should be about.
I can make a short comment. I agree that we do not need additional layers of regulatory bodies or whatsoever, and I think this was also not really, as I understood at least, the initial question from the back there. But what I also said earlier, I think my experience at least is, and I would like to raise this question also with Stefan, at governmental level and public engagement, public investment, setting legislation, giving direction where we want to go, it is important to continue dialogues. And these dialogues are multilateral, I think, very often and important, and may appear a citizen completely useless and so on, and maybe they are overdone in the way they are organized, like G20 meetings or G7 meetings or whatsoever. Nevertheless, I experienced one example to compare to energy. There is a EU-US dialogue on energy, and it has three areas. One is policy, one is energy supply, and the other is energy technology and research. And the EU and the US talks about that topic in a very broad frame, and this is important. And I can tell you, at the time of the Ukraine and Crimea crisis, these discussions were all of a sudden tremendously important because it concerned the functioning of the energy supply in large parts of Europe. So maybe only for a certain time, but also in relation, it was at that time, to the Russian position, this dialogue was enormously important. And then all of a sudden you can switch it on and coordinate quickly and come quickly to the right discussion. This was not a regulatory body or was not also a standard setting. So I think this type of what do we really need and what is the objective related to AI can also be a type of discussion. And okay, I see it purely from the research and innovation point of view and not so much maybe on regulatory or whatsoever. But so there I think needs to be a distinction. I agree that certain bodies and certain organizations are there to regulate and to foster this. But we also need to have dialogues. I think we on AI we are only starting a dialogue in the Union between member states and the Union, and let's not even talk about the Transatlantic. We are quite far away from that.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe okay. Just in 1 minute then?
Okay. So really briefly, my humble view is I don't think there is necessarily duplication in the work of these various organizations. It's a tremendous, very important issue that has multiple angles. And each of these organizations see AI in their own lens, and that's great. They need to process the importance of AI, how this is going to affect each organization's world. So the OECD, for example, is looking at AI in public policy for governments and for their membership. The G20 looking at AI for economic growth and societal impact. So each groups or organization will see it through their own lens. The ILO on the future of work. So the ambition of this panel is really to create an international reference point of globally recognized experts like there exist on climate change, the global expert group or contact group on climate change. So I agree, we have to avoid duplication, but it's such an important topic that I think the more we build expertise and we come at it and we offer this expertise on the platform that and we broaden the membership. So the other very important aspect is that we can include developing countries into this discussion, so it can be an inclusive discussion.
Thank you very much, Stéphane. No, it's very much appreciated. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. I wish you all an excellent summer. The conversation will continue in September, and I would like for you to give a big applause to our panelists. Thank you so much.